All right, guys, welcome aboard. We are going live with the weekly Mac Forum video chat. This is April 24th, I think it is. Uh, Lost track of the date there, but that's okay. Let's see. Yeah, I was right, 24th. We are on track. Probably going to be a short show tonight. If this were NASCAR, this would be the equivalent of a gas and go type stop for those of you that are race fans. Um, just real quick, we got the usual forum rundown of some interesting things, a couple of tips and tricks, and a little bit of Apple related news for this week, as usual. So let's go ahead and kick things right off. First of all, I want to welcome our newest member. We have just over 289,000 members at the moment. The newest of those is Leora Swart. Uh, Welcome aboard. Hope you enjoy your time there. Those of you who have been lurking around and been thinking about becoming a member, keep in mind it doesn't cost you anything, and that's the best way to answer your question. To get your question answered, it seems like every week we have a few people post in the contact us area. That's not a good place for a question, an actual question about your Mac, because only the relatively small number of people in the moderation team see those threads. Whereas if you become a member and post your question, then the question is open to any of our members to provide you with some answers. All right, so let's jump right into things here. Um, a couple of things I want to make sure I tackle right off the bat so I don't forget about them this week. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned some tips for saving some space on your iPhone. If you're like me and you have an iPhone or an iPad that's 16 gigabyte of available space total, you may find that you're running short of space. And I mentioned a couple of tips for buying back some of that space. And one of the tips had to do with downloading a movie that was larger than the device could hold and doing that several times to force the space to basically be consolidated. But one of the things that I also mentioned was deleting any unnecessary apps or apps that are not used regularly that you no longer need. And most of us have a couple of those apps on our iDevices. I've got several on my main Mac because I'm sort of a download junkie, or at least I used to be. I don't know if there's a 12-step program for download addicts who download everything that comes down the pipe, but I, I could have been accused of that at one point. Still have some stuff on my Mac that I rarely use. And most of us have those kinds of things on our iDevices. So one of the things I suggested was deleting apps that you no longer need. Well, one thing I want to be absolutely sure that I mention is before you delete an app, make a backup of your iDevice before you go deleting apps. And here's the reason. And I don't know if I included this in the original tip. This occurred to me just a few minutes before the show, and I haven't had a chance to check the notes from the previous show. Um, when you delete an app, the data that that app generates, high scores in games, drawings that you might have done, uh, if you have a drawing, for example, that you've done, unless you've exported that drawing out somewhere to the cloud or somewhere else, or it's been included as part of a backup, when you delete that app, the data goes with it. So you want to be careful and take some time and make a backup before you delete anything. Because deleting the app in most cases is going to take the data with it. The exception that I can think of would be, for example, in situations like word processors where they have the document is capable of being saved out to another location. But if you do that with most apps, the data goes away, and that when the app goes away, and that means that if you need the data back, you've got a problem unless you've got a backup. So be sure that you back up your uh, iOS device before you make any changes. Um, and then also on the in the way of another tip, I'll give you a tip about the App Store here in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to talk about what reminded me about this tip. Um, Kirk, the iTunes guy McLaren, has, as I mentioned recently, he started a series in his MacWorld column called "Hey Apple, Fix This." Well, his first one was something that I agreed with about the iOS app Notes, where Notes, one of the things you can't change very easily or reliably, well, not easily, is fonts. And he mentioned some possible fixes for that. He's got a new article up, and this time he has some suggestions for the App Store, uh, and specifically two things that he thinks developers should be allowed to do. One of them is there isn't really a way to do demos. In other words, in the days when most people downloaded their apps through shareware, freeware, etc., 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 there were many developers who what they would do is put up a demo of their software. The demo was fully functioning for a certain period of time. That would give you an opportunity to test it, see if it really met your needs, and then it would either stop functioning until you paid for it, or in the case of some apps like Graphic Converter, it had a nag screen that would just get longer and longer and longer as you had not paid for it. This was a good thing if you're a download junkie like I was, where you're downloading a lot of different things and trying them out. Uh, it was good for me when I was writing for about this particular Macintosh, the eZine, because sometimes we would see an app that we were personally interested in and would want to download and try. Can't really do that with the way the App Store is structured. The closest that some developers have come is being able to download the app for free, and then various features are included by in app purchases. Well, one of the things that Kurt mentions is what if you forget which ones you've purchased and added, and later on you go back, you pay the full price, and now you got to remember, okay, do I need to go back and re add these things or not? Um, Also, one of the things that I believe he mentions in the article is that with the old model of app development, quite frequently, app developers would reward loyal customers when, say, a new version came out. They would reward loyal customers by giving you a reduced price on uh, the new version of the app. That is not necessarily an easily handled thing in the way the App Store currently handles things. There, some workarounds. So that leads to my tip for tonight. One of the tips for tonight, rather. If you are in a situation where you want to look at an app, but you're not sure it's right for you, and it's either not free, you see it in the App Store, you've done a search, you see it in the App Store, you're not quite sure it's for you, you'd like to have a demo, but that's not really available in the App Store. One thing to look for as a possibility is uh, most of the time, the listing in the App Store will have a link to the developer's website. And then on that developer's website will be version, a trial version that you can download and try. And then if you, if you decide, hey, this is the right app for me, and you want to buy it through the App Store, then you can go back to that app in the App Store and purchase it. There are a lot of things to like about purchasing software through the App Store, one of which is the ability to re download apps that you've purchased in one location without having to, as someone who has had to rebuild their hard drive a couple of times because of various disasters over the years, the ability to go to one place and download most of my software as opposed to going to each developer and looking up the passcodes, serial numbers, whatever you want to call them. That's a tremendous time saver. But the concerns that Kirk mentions about the App Store are legit. I think it is something that could be addressed, and he has a couple of suggestions for how to address it. Until that's done, as I say, if you would like a demo, check out the developer's website for any particular app. Search the App Store, find the app, go to the developer's website, have a look at the detailed information, download a demo that might be there, and proceed from there. Also, this week, uh, I dug up on the Cult of Mac site one of their listings of 12 neat things you could do with the iWatch. One of the things that you'll see mentioned sometimes on the internet is that there isn't that killer app for the iWatch yet. That must have app for the Apple Watch that everybody has. When there are a lot of people that will argue with the Apple II when it came out that the killer app, the app that really drove things, was something called VisiCalc, which allowed the average user to see a practical thing that you could do with a computer. And later, AppleWorks became a big deal for the same reason. For the iPhone, there have been a number of apps that have been a really big deal uh, that have really helped drive it. I don't know that I can think of one that is a killer for the iWatch, but even with that, there are a lot of neat things you can do. One of them is to locate your iPhone if it's been misplaced. You can use it like an alarm clock. You can take a number of other things to do with your watch without any third party add ons. And as I say, Cult of Mac has 12 of these. I have a link that I'll post up in the show notes later this evening. Um, Another tip that comes from right here on our own Mac forums is a tip for those of you who like to keep your email in sync across multiple devices, sometimes different operating system versions. First of all, this is made a lot easier if you're using an IMAP account. Now, if you're new to figuring this stuff out, one of the critical things, if you're keeping email in sync across multiple devices, that's one of the huge advantages of IMAP accounts. When, let's say, you have your Mac and an iPhone, you're looking at email on your Mac on an IMAP account, you delete a couple of pieces of mail. Later in the day, you're out and about doing things. You check your mail on your iPad or your iPhone, and real quickly, the changes that you made earlier, deleting mail, marking some of it as junk, that kind of thing, are shown up on your iDevice, and vice versa. Things that you remove on the iDevice are shown up as removed on the Mac. But what if and that's pretty cool. That's the way IMAP accounts are supposed to work. But what if, for example, you want to move a piece of mail, let's say from your inbox to another mailbox for organizational purposes, and you still want that organization to show up on the second device. Okay, here's where things get not really tricky, but it has a solution that um, that I had not thought of, and I have a link to the thread that describes this better in the show notes. But what you have to do there to make that work, let's say you've got a piece of email, you want to save it, and when you save it, you want that mirrored over to the other device. Okay, you want to move it to a new mailbox and have that change mirrored over to another device. Here's the key thing: when you make that second mailbox that you're going to be moving things to, make sure that you make it on your IMAP account and not a local uh, a local mailbox within Mac Mail. So, for example, let's just say that I have a bunch of Mac Forum mail and I want to move it and keep it so that I can read it later or it has links that I might need. I want to be sure that I keep it. And when I make that folder to keep it in, I want to make sure that that folder is made somewhere other than locally on my Mac. And you can do this by either going to the web interface for your account, or when you're in mail, make sure when you have that sidebar showing where all your inboxes are, make sure that the place where you make that mailbox is not listed in the on my Mac section. You don't want it there. You're going to want it to be somewhere inside one of the accounts, that one of the IMAP accounts. That's the best way to go. That should solve the problem for you. And as I say, I have a link to that. It's not something I use a lot. And to be honest with you, until I read this thread, I had not really thought a lot about doing that. I need to go through and put my email into some kind of order. I've got some things going back to like 2007, 2008 that I could probably get rid of. As I said, I'm a digital pack rat. Those of you that have known me for a while know this. Yes, dear, only digital. Okay, let's move on before something embarrassing happens here. Okay. Um, Also, one of our members, and my apologies for not remembering. Oh, actually, I'll go up and look because I've got the note right in front of me here. Give me one quick sec to click on it. We have a member uh, who has asked a question. A member named the Skipster, excuse me, asked a question about the kind of connecting cable that you need to plug headsets into the computer and have it recognize both the microphone and the headphone port. Okay. What happens is to him or her is that if they get a cable that to extend the length, in other words, they need a longer cable, so they get one of these extenders, then it doesn't work. Something doesn't work. Now, uh, in this thread are a couple of suggestions for why it might not work and a potential solution. The first reason that it might not work is that extending the cable length may produce too much impedance. And in that case, what's going to happen is there's too much resistance. The signal is not going to get through to the headset. Okay. That's the first possibility. The second possibility, and this is particularly true if you are using uh, earbuds, for example, the Apple earbuds, or some other headsets, particularly those that are designed to mimic the functionality of the earbuds. Um, those earbuds have are essentially what is sometimes referred to as a four ring connector. Okay, it's a think a regular 3.5 millimeter connection, same as a regular headphone, but it's got an extra space in there. So you've got four areas on the connection. You can see the bands in between. And what's so important about that? Well, here's the thing. In a normal three ring connector, what you've got is left ear channel, right ear channel, and the ground. The fourth connector is going to carry the microphone. So in a four connector setup, you've got a microphone, left and right earpiece, and ground. Okay, so that is part of the hangup. If you try to use an extender that's built for these three connections, you're going to lose one of those levels of functionality, and it's usually the microphone. The solution to it is usually to find a connector that supports that fourth connection. I encourage you, if you're having this issue, take a look at the thread. I'll have a link to it, of course, as usual. Uh, and you want to pay particular attention to posts 4, 6, and 9. Charlie and Patrick, and once again, Jake, excuse me, uh, posted some very useful information in there. Those three guys really cleaned that up right away. When I read that thread initially, I didn't answer because I couldn't think of a good way to explain what the problem might be. Another solution that will work with some things pretty well, depending on the headset and how it's built, particularly if it does not have the standard four connection. Uh, if it's just using the other, the Griffin Technologies iMic device, which plugs into USB port on your Mac and then gives you input and output 3.5 millimeter connections. Works pretty well with some headsets and these extender cables. It might be worth looking at as another alternative. But I personally would prefer just getting the four ring cable that you need for most of these headsets. All right. So that takes care of that little tip. Um, if you also, another one, this one does not come specifically from the forum, but comes from uh, an article that describes how to use third party keyboards on your iOS devices. There are some times when you might want to use a different um, keyboard in your iOS device. I find that I have not tried very many of the third party keyboards as of yet. I'm okay with the regular keyboard for the little bit of texting that I do. Um, but there are some out there that I'm seriously thinking about looking at. There's an article that I'll post to. I think it came from Macworld. I have to double check. I noticed I just clicked the link in my notes, and the link is wrong. I accidentally linked to the headphone thread twice in my show notes, so I'll fix that when the notes go up later this evening. But the one of the things I want to be dead sure that I mentioned when it comes to these third party keyboards. Be aware that some of them, you check your privacy settings on your phone. There is a function that is off by default, and it might affect how these keyboards work. Um, a lot of these keyboards are going to send information to the developer's site or some third party site. Uh, There could be a variety of legitimate reasons for this, as in, for example, they want to try to make their autocorrect algorithms better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is controlled in part by your iOS privacy settings. That feature, which basically says give the keyboard full access, is off by default on your iOS devices. So what you're going to want to do is to check that and make sure that it's at a level that you're comfortable with. I'm going to take a real quick look and make sure I know where that setting is. I forgot to do that earlier. Just give you a real quick rundown on where to go. You're going to want to go into settings, and then you're going to want to go into excuse me, I lost it here for a second. One of the things you're going to want to be sure that you do is to check and make sure all of this is set the way that you want it to be. Give me one sec, and go into privacy, and it's not there. I will double check that setting. I jotted a note down and accidentally deleted the note. So I'll fix that for you, let you know where that is. We do have a link to that. Once I go back and fix that article link, all the information you need to check that will be right there in the article. So that's one more thing to think about. It's not a huge problem, but it does set you up for being aware of what the privacy settings are and some situations where you might want or need to change them. And last but not least, I have a link this week to Kirk McLaren's discussion of spaces, these virtual desktop setups that exist in OS 10 and have been around for a while. Um, the idea here is to be working in an environment and only show you the apps that you need to get that specific task done when you need them, even though there are other apps running in the background, and maybe have a different space with a different set of apps. So you could, for example, have your web browsing and email open in one space and have video editing, something like Handbrake or Final Cut or etc., running in a second space, so that the clutter from your email and etc. is not distracting you while you're working in Final Cut. I don't use spaces a lot. I used to, but now that I have a dual monitor set up, I don't use spaces as much as I used to. What I'm typically doing is using the second monitor for things that I don't need to see all the time. But spaces still has some useful things. I will tell you that if you've accidentally created a space and you shift between the two spaces by accident, it is possible. I've done it, and some other users have posted similar things. It will confuse you a little bit, especially if uh, uh, both of the spaces have the same desktop pattern. One of the things that I like to do when I was using spaces was to assign each space its own background, desktop background, so that I could look immediately and know which space I was in. And I also did that because, for example, if you're doing photo editing, you might want one type of background with kind of neutral so that it doesn't offer a color cast or something like that. Whereas with other tasks, you might want a different type of background. So there are a lot of advantages there, a lot of nice things about using spaces. And instead of trying to summarize Kirk's article, I'm just going to provide a link to it because, as I say, uh, I don't use spaces a lot. I'm not as fluent with it as I used to be. And he has a lot of good suggestions for things that will make spaces even more useful. That's one of those many features in the OS that are not necessarily things that I use every day, but they're still a good idea. And that's going to just about do it this week, folks. Uh, as I say, we had just a few tips stuck in there. I do want to mention before I go the date for Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference has been set. As you know, that is their summer event. That's the big event for the summer. It usually comes in mid June, and this year, it does again. It's scheduled for June 13th to 17th in San Francisco. As usual, tickets are probably going to be kind of hard to come by. Those of you that are interested, I'm sure you'll be able to see it when it goes live, when the keynote goes live, because there are a number of Mac related websites that usually stream this event. If you have an Apple TV device, it will also appear on there as a special event. Uh, those of you that may be new to Mac may not know, Worldwide Developer Conference is where Apple frequently previews features that are coming up in the next operating system. Last year, they gave a preview of iOS 9 and what was coming up in that. The rumor mill will be grinding away, of course, as usual. I've already seen a rumor that says that Apple is going to skip iPhone 7 and go to iPhone 8. Personally, I don't care what they call it. Um, I'm more interested in um, the mechanics, if you will. I know that's not the greatest word, but the what they call something during the Worldwide Developer Conference is not that big a deal to me. I'm more interested in what you can do with it. How does it change the user experience? Um, some of the things that have been rumored in the past have materialized. Others have not. For instance, there's been a rumor around for a couple of years now that a future version of the operating system would move away from HFS Plus as the file system to, I believe it's ZFS. I won't go into that, the pros and cons of that this evening. That wasn't the point. That's just to give you an idea how some of the things materialize, some of them don't. So look for some interesting announcements to come out. Most of the important stuff, or the things that are noticeable to the most number of users, will be hinted at and then previewed to some extent during the keynote. So, as usual, I'll be keeping my eyes open for that. And probably the same day of the keynote, uh, I will, because that's not typically done on a Sunday. It's usually early in the week, so it'll be probably the 13th this year. That's not going to be on a Sunday, but that's okay, because what I'll do, as I did with the last media event, is we'll push the show out that day with commentary on what I think the important things about the keynote are. And if you want to tune in to what I say and disagree with me, that's fine. But that's going to just about do it for this week. As usual, I'll see you in the forum. I'm glad to have you check out the show during the week, and I'll see you in the forum. Until next Sunday, this has been your host, Sly Dude. We'll see you in the forum.